Okay, today we're going to talk about firestorms, and there's a reason for that. We'll get to that in a few minutes. It does seem like every week I'm faced with this. There's some things I'd like to cover, but I always feel like I'm a prisoner of the tyranny of the here and now because of everything that happens on a weekly basis. It's unbelievable. It's hard to keep up with. I was told that somebody takes the audio and puts it up on a podcast, and I was told I'm on vacation this week, so I don't have time to take your ums out, so you better be careful. So if I sound like I'm not saying anything, it's because I'm consciously trying not to say, you know what. We talk about the convergence of events. Each week it seems like there's more and more things that seem to be converging. Those of you around here who have been here for a while know that we've been talking about these things for many years now. The things just seem to be growing. It does seem that I've used these old covers from Foreign Policy magazine just to show that secular people seem to understand that something is going on. I thought I'd start off today, though, with somebody sent me, and I apologize, I don't even remember who sent it to me and what the source was, but it was just some things I was thinking, phrases. It's the type of thing that I think about also. So here's a few of them. I was thinking, if leftists don't believe in biological gender, then why did they march for women's rights? You can just say amen, or, if you agree. I was thinking, if women do the same job for less money, why do companies hire men to do the same job for more money? Because they're greedy and they want to make money, at least according to that little socialist that's running for Congress in New York. I heard an interview with her this week about what do you do? Where are you going to get the money to pay for all this? Well, we'll just add all this taxes. Well, you understand that the taxes that you collect over 10 years that you're projecting won't even pay for it for 1 year of what you want to do. And that's when I was going to say her eyes glaze over, but they always look like they're glazed over to me, so that's just me. I was thinking, if you rob a bank in a sanctuary city, is it illegal or is it just an undocumented withdrawal? And I was thinking, if Democrats don't want foreigners involved in our elections, why do they think it's all right for illegals to vote? And then I think this is the last one that I have. I was thinking, why is it that Democrats think superdelegates are fine, but they have a problem with the Electoral College? One of the big news this week was investors, unlike Facebook, they had a massive drop. I think they dropped in value one day $120 billion. Now listen, Mark Zuckerberg lost 20-some billion dollars in net worth. Do you think he had to move? He put his house up for, any of his homes up for sale? I mean, so the difference is he's worth what, 70 billion instead of 90 billion? I mean, does it really have an impact on his lifestyle? Seriously. How many self-driving cars can you own, for that matter? Well, I want to talk first. This was the week of the Great Blood Moon, and so there were maps and there were live places you could go here and you could find every place where there would be a full lunar eclipse. They had observatories and they had live video feeds of the blood moon. And they looked like this. For hours they looked like this, essentially. It was big, it was beautiful, it was spectacular. This is a picture of a mosque in Kazan, Russia. Down here in the upper right-hand corner is, I think that's Sydney. Here is the Temple of Poseidon in Greece. A couple shots of that framing the blood moon. this has been something that has been hyped for a long time in the Bible prophecy community. Now, there is a verse that says the moon will be turned to blood before that great and terrible day of the Lord. And that day is coming, but it happens in a specific time frame. But there have been a lot of videos, not a lot of videos, there have been a massive amount of videos done about this. A lot of them have tried to, originally when they came out, the statement was when the tetrad happened a couple years ago, 4 blood moons in a short period of time, they were saying this is the rapture. The rapture is going to happen. The tribulation is going to start. The 70th week is going to start. None of that has really panned out, has it? Unless we're really in the 70th week and we just don't realize it. But I think we would have some clues. But then what happened was people predicted the rapture. Then they started saying, well, it's a high watch window for the rapture. Then it became, well, it's really about the Feast of Pentecost. Or everything changed. And I just put up, this is a screenshot from Blood Moon on YouTube, what I show. Like here, dream, God says rapture is about to take place. People like Steve Fletcher, I don't know how many predictions he's up to now. It's in the dozens. He's batting 1,000. If striking out is how you get your points for batting. I just want to point one out. Up here at the top it says, rapture occurs on or before August 12, 28 at True Pentecost. And the YouTube channel is GEVTE. This video, it's about 58 minutes, has 638,000 views as of a few days ago. He has retitled that video, or whoever did that, has retitled that video. It's less than 638,000 times, but he's just about changing the title for each view. He's changed it at least 10 times. Because what he does is he says, well, September 23rd last year, he was saying. Then it was June 21st. Then it was June 21 to 23. Then it moved into July. Now it's to August 12th. And I even saw one time he had it titled, Sometime This Fall. And this damages everybody who believes and takes Bible prophecy seriously. I mean, really, how many of these do we have to put up with? And I'm upset about it. It makes me upset because if you do talk about Bible prophecy and you try to warn people, they'll say, well, look at all these predictions that haven't come true. And I think those criticisms are valid. So I don't think I've ever predicted a date. I think once things start to really unfold, we'll be able to put some pretty clear dates on things. I think there are clear passages that suggest that the second coming of Jesus happens on a Day of Atonement. And there's a number of reasons I've taught about that in the past. And you can kind of work backward from that. But I guess if people are doing this, at some point you just have to say enough is enough. And now what people are putting up, they'll go nameless, they know who they are. They'll put it up and say, well, there's this blood moon on July 27th. Now, no, I'm not saying that anything is going to happen on July 27th. Don't make me a predictor of what's going to happen on July 27th. And they get views. There was a man who put up videos about September 23rd. He put them up in 2 different languages, between the English and the other language. He had somewhere around 13 or 14 million views on those videos. And now he'll say he's always making, look, another time you need to watch. We should always be ready. Here's my take on it. We should always be ready to meet the Lord. Raise your hand if you know the exact day that you're going to die. How many of you? Not as people can't see the audience, there's not a single hand raised because none of us know the day that we're going to die. We should always live our lives as if we are going to meet the Lord the next day, that day, the next hour, the next minute. I remember Camille called me one night. She called me on a Saturday night and said that you couldn't read, you couldn't read scripture that Sunday. That was Saturday night. Monday, she was with the Lord. None of us know when that time will come. That ought to be motivation for us to live a life, a holy life, a sanctified life, so that we can always meet the Lord in the right spiritual condition. None of us knows when our meeting is with the Lord. Events in the days and weeks. In Greece, in Athens, I don't know what the death toll is now. Wildfires swept through some resort in suburban areas outside of Athens. Last I saw, it was over 70 or 80 people had died. The pictures were just absolutely frightening. And now, everything that happens is on video. I mean, there's a shooting going on and people are running away, but they're filming it while they're running away. Every time you see the president or vice president speak, what do you see in the crowd? You see a whole bunch of, if you have a camera shot from the back, you see a whole bunch of video screen, camera, iPhone or whatever your type of phone you have, screens taking pictures of everything. This was the result. And people were trapped in their cars. They found two little twin girls, 11 years old, in the arms of their grandparents. All of them passed away. This is a picture of the Parthenon in Athens, looking towards the smoky sky. And here's some drone footage of some of the fires and damage that took place outside of Athens. That was earlier in the week. And there's other, you can find, like I said, you can find in a lot of drone footage now of these aftermath of these fires and disasters. That was early in the week. And then, literally a couple days later, this was Athens. Floods. Now, this seems to be happening more and more. I've heard there's been flooding going on in Maryland, Pennsylvania. A lot of rain. Somebody told me yesterday that they were driving back from northern Ohio on Thursday evening, and they got stuck in a rainstorm, and there was like 3 inches of rain in 20 minutes. Now, I drove back from Cleveland. I got a couple drops on my windshield, but I must have just got there ahead of the storm. But so what you're seeing now is you're seeing fires, firestorms, then floods. A little over a month ago, this was outside Durango, Colorado, one of the most beautiful places that I've ever been. The San Juan Mountains in southwest Colorado. And this is a time lapse of 4 hours in 1 minute of what happened in that fire north of Durango, up near, I think it was near Hermosa. It's called the 416 fire. That was in early June. Then, about a month later in Durango, this is what happened. Outside of Durango, this is the KOA campground north of Durango. There's the Animas River comes down through there. Pam and I actually stayed at a bed and breakfast on there one time on the river. And it's an awesome river. If If you remember the scene from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid where they jump off the cliff, that was filmed there in that valley north of Durango. Then Redding, California. I don't even have pictures of Southern California. The Idlewild fire between the Inland Empire, Ontario, and Palm Springs. Up in the mountains, they had a fire called the Carson Fire. This is the Carr Fire outside of Redding. Number of people were killed. Look at these pictures, these videos of what's going on. And people just said it came sweeping through. They didn't even get notice. They didn't have time to give people notice to get out. I've been in California a number of times when they've had fires, and they just seem to be, I don't know if it's just me, but it seems like these are increasing. They've been all over the United States. Northern California, all over California, they're having fires right now. They closed Yosemite Valley this week, a couple days, because of fires. Here's the aftermath in Redding. Some of the neighborhoods. And it's just everywhere. I could show you pictures of Japan. They have an earthquake in Japan, then a few days later they have a flood. And what I'm seeing now is a pattern emerging of these things happening in twos in relatively the same area. And a friend of mine suggested, I won't say her name, but I thought it was a wise observation that out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, things should be established, is what the Bible says. And now we're seeing these disasters happening in the same area in really pairs. Is this, and at some point we have to say, is God trying to send people a message? Now, there are a lot of people that will, as soon as one of these things happens, I can guarantee you somebody will be on the internet posting a video about how these are directed energy weapons, or these are being caused by the people who want to establish a new world order. And look, maybe some of them are. But then again, folks, maybe the Lord is allowing these things to happen with greater frequency to send people a message. When you look through Revelation, all of these judgments come upon the world. And I can guarantee you, when those happen, as horrific as they are, there will be people out there posting videos on YouTube, assuming the internet is still up, saying, oh, this is man-made. This is all man-made. There's a natural explanation for this. But at some point, we have to say, maybe there isn't a natural explanation for this. Maybe God is trying to send a message to people, and we're just not paying attention. This is an article from Wall Street Journal yesterday. Resigned to endless war. And these are secular newspapers that are looking at the world situation, and they're saying things like endless war. I'll show you some others later. In Great Britain, there are 3 major Jewish weekly papers. The Jewish Chronicle on the left, Jewish News in the middle, and Jewish Telegraph on the right. They have, this week, for the first time, they all published the same editorial because they are concerned about the direction that things are going in England with the growth of anti-Semitism, particularly in the Labour Party. Someone in the Labour Party, Margaret Hodge, criticized the leadership, and she was immediately threatened with being drummed out of the Labour Party. How dare you question the leadership and suggest that we might be anti-Semitic? But then there are people in the Labour Party that actually are really bad anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish people with the statements that they make, and nothing ever seems to happen to them unless they get really, really bad. Rod Little, writing in this morning's Sunday, The Times of London, had this to say. He was addressing this issue. He says, I got a friendly acknowledgement from his friend Andrew, and later a two-line reply from the BBC stating that the corporation's coverage is impartial. The complaint was that it seems like Hamas, they blow up the border fence, they send kites in that destroy thousands of acres of crops, they launch a couple hundred rockets into Israel, and it never makes the BBC coverage. Israel responds, and it's all over the place. And they have meetings about it at the UN. Now, Nikki Haley and the staff there at the UN are thankfully trying to change that, and I think they're making some progress. So he got this two-line reply from the BBC stating that the corporation's coverage is impartial. Now, rational thinking people look at it and say, it's not impartial. He mentions a guy, he says he has spent most of his life railing against Israel and Jews while claiming to be a moderate. And his book is serialized by Radio 4. Of course, it will not serialize a book by an Israeli to provide the political balance that the corporation is duty-bound to strive for, even if, frankly, it doesn't strive terribly hard. I have no objection to hearing Mr. Shahada's lamentations. They are a view and one of which we should be aware. My complaint is that the other side will simply not be put. My suggestion to Andrew is that Radio 4 could rectify this imbalance by serializing Warrior, an autobiography by the former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. But that's not going to happen, is it? The BBC and Radio 4 in particular are in the grip of what the American author Tom Wolfe called radical chic attitudinizing. He spells it with the S, not the Z. In other words, they are naive middle-class liberals who believe that the Palestinian cause is unequivocally just, and there is no real argument about that, which is why when Hamas rains 200 rockets and mortars down upon Israel, you hear nothing on the BBC. You hear about it only when Israel responds. The question is, are Radio 4 and the BBC anti-Semitic? When does a fashionable stupidity teeter into racial hatred? An important question, especially for those of you who think anti-Semitism is a preserve of the neo-Nazi far right, elements of the Islamic world, and of course, the Labor Party. Last week, the guitar-strumming half-wit Billy Bragg agreed that the Jews had work to do to improve their relations with the Labor Party. In other words, had to stop complaining about anti-Semitism. These people, they ask for it, don't they? All their own fault, really. And the answer to the question about Corbyn's Labor and Billy Bragg and the BBC is simple. The obsession with Israel and the radical chic stuff that leads to anti-Semitism, they become one and the same thing. And one of the things that they were complaining about in the Jewish newspapers in England, Great Britain, was that the Labor Party was not really accepting the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism, which is this: anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities, and I might add also against Israel. Because what you'll find this with the replacement theology crowd in the United States, Christ at the checkpoint, and elsewhere, is they really don't like the nation-state of Israel. They really didn't like that nation-state law that was enacted last week that I talked about. It's not that bad. It really just states what's going on. It doesn't mean that other people can't live there or that other people don't have value or worth. It's just that in this particular place, on this particular plot of land, which is minuscule compared to everything else in the world, all the other land in the world, the Jews have a right to have a national homeland. And look what they've done with it. It's amazing what's happened there in Israel since the nation of Israel came back into existence in 1948. It was a miracle. It's not finished yet. There's still a great, glorious future after some intervening problems, I'm afraid to say, if I understand Scripture correctly. But there's a great, glorious future centered around that land. And God has a plan. And people like Lynn Hybels and Brian McLaren and other people, they don't accept that. And people want to say they'll give them a pass. Well, they've done other good stuff. And frankly, I don't see that. I don't think Lynn Hybels has been a plus for the evangelical church. Through her, a lot of mysticism, through Willow Creek, a lot of mysticism, spiritual formation came into the evangelical church. Willow Creek even came out years ago and said, hey, we did it wrong, and then they promptly went ahead and did the same thing again. This is an interesting juxtaposition. In some respects, they're related. The New York Times here, and I'll show you an article from Haaretz. New York Times had a big article about how Jews are still having to leave France. It's just not safe. Now, they really never tie it to the immigrant population, but it's clear if you really read between the lines in the article that that's what the cause of this anti-Semitism is. Now, Haaretz had this, the French panic has passed. So Haaretz they're sort of like the, never has heard a discouraging word, I guess. Now, they're correct that a lot of people didn't immigrate from France yet, but they will. Europe is in a very precarious position. I don't think that things can be turned around in Europe. They're tearing themselves apart. Here's a picture. These are two pictures from Spain. You remember I played the video about the border fence in Morocco, the little Spanish enclave there, Ceuta? And this is a picture taken this week. And I just would ask you a question. In the picture in the upper right-hand corner, how many females are there? Okay, 0. Now, I should qualify that question, I guess. This is America in 2018. Using a standard definition that there is a male and female part of the species, and that you can usually make an observation and tell which is which, do you see any women in that photograph in the upper right? Okay, with the same qualification, I feel like I'm in a deposition, what do you mean by that word? This is a boat landing on the beach in Spain this week. How many females do you see in that photograph? It was a boat that came from Africa. None. This happens over and over again. We've made this observation over and over again. 85-90% of the immigrants that came in that great wave a few years ago into Europe, 85-90% were military-age males. My observation at the time was, and it remains, in the past, it used to be that invading armies provided their own transportation. Europe has changed that not only do they help them transport them to the front lines, they then give them aid and assistance when they get there. And then they wonder why things are falling apart. An organization called Jafira came out with a report this week, a very interesting report. Sweden will remain Sweden, but just a name. How does that happen? Well, what they've done is they take the birth rate in Sweden, which is 1.6, among the native Swedish women. And they want to show the effect of population and how, so the white dots are Swedish, the black dots are immigrants into Sweden. This is Sweden. Okay, so this is 1970. You see native population, essentially was 99%. Look how it changes, 85, 90, 95. as immigrants come into Sweden. So now we're up to about our time. You see the population is staying relatively the same. That's because native Sweden people are not having babies, so their population is actually declining, but the immigrants come in, they might have a much higher birth rate. So now we'll get up to 2,100, and we'll see that population by 2,100 would be 14 million, roughly 4.5 million of which would be native Swedish people. Do you think that will have a change on, if the Lord does not come back, do you think that will have a change on the way Europe is constituted? That's why, we all want to argue about where the Antichrist comes from, and, it's a revived Roman Empire, or it's, Turkey, or it's Islamic, it's not Islamic, and everybody gets all upset with the other people who hold the other view. I'm open to all views, but let me just say that if the Lord doesn't return, Europe will be Muslim in very short order. Russia will be Muslim. Parts of Russia, reports I've read, in foreign policy, hardly, out there publications say that the current population of Moscow is about 25% Sunni Muslim. And if you understand that, then you understand a little bit about why Putin is doing what he's doing. And at some point, the one thing that will unite all those people is doing something about that Israel problem. That's my personal problem. And we have an Israel problem. Of course, here's the Daily Star from Lebanon, the Blood Moon, and the article here, violent clashes break out on the Temple Mount after Muslim prayers. Now, I follow the Israeli news very carefully. I do not ever recall seeing violent clashes break out at Western Wall after Jewish prayers. I never see that. And why are they upset? Why were they so upset? Because Jews went up there on the Temple Mount on Tish B'Av. How dare they come up here on the Temple Mount? And I know people want to say Jordan's now a friend of Israel, but look, they don't want Jews over there. They don't want the Jews there. That's their official position. They control that area, Jordan does, and they don't want Jews. This is always on kind of teetering on things. Here's President Trump this week tweeting. The Iranian president said, you people in the United States, you better not mess with us. We'll take care of you. To which Donald Trump, surprisingly really, responded to Iranian President Rouhani, never ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. We are no longer a country that will stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious. The foreign secretary, this provoked a response, of course, from the Iranians. The foreign minister, Zarif, said this, will color us impressed. The world heard even harsher bluster a few months ago, and Iranians have heard them, albeit more civilized ones, for 40 years. We've been around for millennia and seen fall of empires, including our own, which lasted more than the life of some countries. Be cautious. President Rouhani came back and said this, Americans must understand that war with Iran is the mother of all wars, and peace with Iran is the mother of all peace. Rouhani said that while addressing diplomats Sunday in Tehran, according to Iran's state-run news agency, the Iranian leader also had a message for U.S. President Trump. Do not play with the lion's tail because you will regret it eternally. You know that this war will destroy all that you possess. You will start this war, but we will be the ones to impose its end. Therefore, you have to be careful about insulting the Iranian people and the president of our republic. That came from Soleimani, the general, who said that in a speech in Tehran to political leaders. You know that this war will destroy all that you possess. This is from the general, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. You will start this war, but we will be the ones to impose its end. Therefore, you have to be careful about insulting the Iranian people and the president of our republic. You know our power in the region and our capabilities in asymmetric war. We will act and we will work. Well, that's interesting. This week in Pakistan, a new leader came in. I think he's Muslim. He was a cricket star. I guess that's the equivalent of a TV star here in the United States. But if a war happened between Pakistan and India, they're both nuclear powers, and people are concerned about who is this guy? He has all this nuclear weaponry under his control right now. A war like that, the smoke of that war, it's estimated, would cover the earth within a matter of months and could result in 10 to 40% decline in crop yields in the United States from a change in temperature. Erdogan is moving all over to try to enforce his view of things. He did allow the American pastor Andrew Brunson to go to house arrest this week. Trump has said that if you don't release him, there'll be sanctions. Erdogan is essentially saying, I dare you. So we'll see how that comes out. But what Erdogan has done, and I've been reading these articles for many months. This is one from the New York Times, but Foreign Policy and some of the other foreign geopolitical magazines and blogs have been covering this. Erdogan is neutralizing people all over the world that might be associated with his rival, Fethullah Gulen, who lives up in the Poconos. He was exiled many years ago. And here, this is one, a Turkish educator was seized in Mongolia just last week. Erdogan is trying to become the Sultan, the Caliph of that empire. There's an interesting article in Foreign Policy this week called "The Summer of Israel's Contentment." Now, we talk a lot about Ezekiel 38 and 39, and while I do know that this will happen, I personally don't think it's imminent. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. If you look at the description of what happens in Ezekiel 38 and 39, it does say that these invading armies come from the north they're a mighty army, a lot of people with them. Right now, I don't see a mighty army on the borders of Israel. I see preparations being made. I see tens of thousands of rockets that Hezbollah has. I see Syria retaking the areas of near the Golan border. But I don't see a mighty army just yet. But pay attention, because it could happen. And Iran is trying to consolidate control and their people in Syria. It would appear that their main reason for doing so is to eventually take out Israel. So there is this, certainly elements of Ezekiel 38 and 39 are being put in place. I mean, I just don't think there's any question about that. But listen, this is what this article says. It talks about the fact that Israel, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, is living with there's some, it says I'll come against the land of unwalled villages. And so the question is it actually unwalled villages, or is it the people are living there with a sense of security? Now, I personally believe it's the latter, that they're living there with a sense of security. And if you go to Israel today, you know, their people go up to the Golan Heights to watch the fighting across the border. And they're not really worried about an invasion coming. And they do live with a sense of security. And some of that is by Some of that is by design. You can't go anywhere without being on a security camera in Israel, particularly in the old city and in places around Jerusalem. But listen to what this article says. These are surreal times in Israel. Despite being surrounded by conflict on almost every border, Israelis are surprisingly at ease with their regional predicament. Now, to me, at least my understanding of the way that word is used about the sense of security in Ezekiel 38, this sounds very much like what that verse is talking about. They've resisted the temptation to let a spate of arson attacks that have scorched fields adjoining Gaza to ruin their mood. Casualties to Israeli people and property, lamentable as they are, have been limited. Notwithstanding a nominal concern that fighting could escalate, Israelis trust that the Israeli Defense Forces can protect them against all comers. Life in the country continues according to its own idiosyncratic rhythm. And this is true. A report came out just a little while ago ranking the most powerful nations on the earth. I think the United States was still listed as number 1, China, Russia, 2, 3. Israel, little tiny Israel, the size of New Jersey, the size of Lake Michigan, was number 8. If my understanding of Ezekiel 38 is correct, and of course, I'm pretty sure that it is, he said humbly, this is the condition that we would expect Israel to be in when this invasion takes place. I could show you a video of, the Israeli Defense Force, they're the 7th biggest arms dealer in the world among countries. Little Israel. They have 1% of the land that the Arab nations around them have? They have 8 or 9 million people. It's an incredible thing. Their economy is one of the strongest in the world, if not the strongest right now. Their currency is very strong. These are all things that the Bible says they'll be living with this sense of security when this invasion happens. Is this the one? I would suggest to you that I don't know, but you should pay attention. Other things in the region are concerning from a geopolitical context. The Houthis, which are in Yemen, this is the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. This is Africa, Djibouti, across the straits there. And Saudi Arabia, there have been attacks on Saudi oil tankers going through that. They go up the Red Sea to the Suez Canal through the Mediterranean because it's the old shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So they come out of the Persian Gulf, they come around the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula, they go up the Red Sea through the Suez to take gas and oil to Europe. Now Saudi Arabia said, nope, we're not going to do that because the Houthis and the Iranians are attacking our tankers. So what will they do? They'll go all the way down around Africa. And one thing I've learned when you study, most of our maps do not give you the scope of the size of Africa. I can say this very clearly. Africa is really, really big. It's huge, huge, enormous. And that adds 2-3 weeks to getting the oil to markets. But if there's a disruption in the supply chain, and then Iran this week was saying, well, we're going to shut down, they do this about every year, we're going to shut down the Straits of Hormuz and interrupt the oil flow, and it's about 30-35% of the oil that the world uses comes through the Straits of Hormuz there in the Persian Gulf. All of these things mean that all of this oil supply and all this stuff is very, very precarious. It can change overnight. Now, our government officials have said, look, if they try to mine the Persian Gulf, we'll take care of it very quickly. But the question is, well, how are you going to take care of it? And is that going to cause a bigger war? And then the suggestion was from the Iranians this week that they have sleeper cells in the United States. Now, I don't know how they would get through our highly secure border during the Obama administration, but that's another subject. So let's look at Syria, and then we'll wrap this up today. So this week, a significant thing happened. So just to kind of give you the geography, you can see the, uh-oh, there's one of those Now she'll wonder what happened to my, he just stopped talking. So here we have the Sea of Galilee. This area in blue here, that's the Golan Heights. That's the area that Israel took from Syria in the 1967 war. And there's a status of forces agreement. Along the eastern edge of the Golan Heights is a no man's land. For many years, that was administered by the United Nations. In 2014, a few years into the Syrian civil war, some of the Syrian rebel groups kidnapped, I believe it was about 40 UN workers here near Kenitra. And if you've ever go to Israel, there's a nice overlook there. There's a big mountain right behind you that has a lot of listening devices on it. When Pam and I were up there, and I made a wrong turn and actually started down an old UN road towards the no man's land, and I turned around very quickly and got out of there, but I was saying is guys up there are probably listening to everything we're saying, and they're just kind of chuckling about the stupid American down there that can't follow his GPS. And I didn't take that personally, by the way. But so this whole area is essentially a no man's land. There's a status of forces agreements entered into between Israel and Syria in 1974. The ISIS still controls very small parts of Syria. If I had done this a couple weeks ago, the area that ISIS controlled right along, this is the Jordan border here, the Israeli border here, and this is Syria. This area was bigger. The Syrian government, with the assistance of the Russians, are cleaning the area up. They still have this area. This area over here is pretty much gone to control. The rebels control this area, and then there's some area, you can sort of see it right here on the right side of the map. It goes over towards the Iraq border. So what they're doing is they're taking the rebels as they take over this area down here along the Golan Heights, the Syrian government with the assistance of Russia and Iran, and they're taking the rebels and saying, look, surrender, or you can go up here to the northern province near Idlib, all the way up near the Turkish border. And so this is the area that the Syrian government controls now. And this has changed dramatically over the last month. This yellow area up here at the top in the north, here, and then there's a little pocket right here, that's controlled by the Kurds. The other area, very light green, that's called the Olive Branch area. That's Operation Olive Branch, which is Erdogan and the Turkish army is trying to take over that area. And I showed you maps where Erdogan wants to come down further into northern Syria and Iraq and take it over. And he wants to get rid of the Kurds because he views the Kurds as an enemy. And so the Kurds this week started talking with Assad about what's our role in the future of Syria. They've sort of resigned themselves to the fact that Assad is going to remain in control. This is Dara. No. This is, it's either Dara or it's what used to be the Palestinian refugee camp in Damascus, Yarmouk. Now look, ISIS was in there. They had come in. They had forced out a lot of Palestinians. So when Assad was trying to take control, he came in and he bombed it a little bit. He barrel bombed it to get rid of people. And so, there used to be hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that lived in this area. And they're all gone. Now, if Israel did this to the Palestinian refugee camp in Nablus, which is not near this size, but if they did anything along, what do you think the world would do? But Assad does it, and look, you can say Assad had reason to do it because ISIS was trying to take down his regime, and ISIS is really bad people. But this was starting to look like this before the ISIS people came in. So here's another map that shows areas of control. You see here, there's this ISIS area. This is what the rebels held. This is a map just a couple weeks ago, and things have changed. This is the Golan Heights right here. This is Israel, or as it says on this map, occupied Syria. And so the question is, what's going to happen? The Daily Star in Lebanon, which has hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million Syrian refugees living in it, says their view of what happened in the front page editorial was back to the status quo. Listen to just what some of this says. As all signs in Syria point to a return, as all signs in Syria point to a return to the pre-2011 status quo, that's before the civil war started, a conspiracy is unraveling. For years, several nations, the first of them Russia, along with the United Nations, have been in on it, arranging talks and recognizing opposition groups. Now it is becoming apparent that this was all just procrastination, or worse, part of a broader theater that would allow a military victory for President Assad, backed by one of the mightiest air forces in the world and a plethora of sectarian militias supported by Iran. Now, after 7 years of a war that has killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions, Assad has been emboldened by his victories by the prospect of hanging on to his brutal dictatorship. He has promised another massacre in Idlib province. That would be this area up here in the north. Now, let me go back here. This area up here, that's where he's putting the rebels on buses and moving them up there. And they're saying he's going to go after them. He has promised another massacre in Idlib province, of course with Russian support, and has threatened the White Helmets rescue workers with being liquidated like any other terrorist. When he was down, Assad recognized all kinds of statements about democracy, even though we all know that a leopard cannot change its spots. This is pretty stunning. This is an official paper in next door Lebanon saying these things. Now it is clear that all of this was just a delaying strategy ready to be discarded at the opportune moment. Meanwhile, in the UN, US and European countries have sat idly by, offering words, all of them hot air, and effectively becoming a partner in the tragedy, allowing the regime to get away with murder. The UN and the West now face either dealing with a dictator who continues to massacre his own people, or taking action to force the country towards some sort of change that it can start the journey towards joining the civilized world. Regime victory celebrations are simply a promise of more dictatorship in a country awash with weapons, more spilling of blood as the doors to vendetta are open. In other words, it isn't over in Syria. This report, this is on the front page of the New York Times just the other day. Scores of Syrian prisoners have died in custody, families are told. One lady said she was, in the early part of the war, she was able to bribe prison guards and see her son who was in prison in Syria. He had been part of a rebel group. He was arrested, put in prison, and now she received a report this week that he died in 2013. Her family's been hoping for this all along. The treatment of them in these prisons has been fairly brutal. This week, though, was important because this town of Kenitra that I pointed out, which has been essentially abandoned for some time, Assad forces came and they raised the flag in Kenitra. I thought I had a video of that. Apparently, I forgot to insert it, but I'm running short on time. You can find plenty. You can see them climbing up on this, climbing up on the dome in Kenitra. I'll tell you what, give me 1 second here and I'll just actually throw it in because it's... Okay. Here we go. This shows the troops coming into Kenitra. And you'll see them raising the flag on these buildings. These are buildings that you can see sometimes very clearly. Sometimes you need binoculars to see them from the Golan Heights. but you'll actually see some mountains in the background. This is a church that's located there. This has been pretty much abandoned since 1967. But now the Syrians, this is a very significant thing to Assad, is to go back and take back Khanit. I mean, because his father didn't even have really good control of this area. This is the border. And this is the mountain that you stand on that mountain, and you see the Israeli army listening post up there. And you stand on the mountain, you can look over into this area. That's how close it is to Israel. And so now they've raised the Syrian flag on this particular area. There are a number of good articles this week in the Jerusalem Post and elsewhere, one of which I don't have any slides for, was by Seth Fransman about, can Israel sustain a two-front war? Because Israel's in kind of a, even though they're secure and they feel pretty good about everything, it is a very dicey situation. You have the problems in Gaza. By the way, Gaza's not surrounded by Israel, you know. Egypt, the southern border of Gaza is Egypt, not Israel. So don't say that the Israelis have them surrounded. They don't. Just like when people tell you that, well, this border wall, this separation barrier completely surrounds Bethlehem. It doesn't. It doesn't. The separation barrier, on a large part, was to stop sniper fire from coming into Israel. And ask Randy Smith about that. So there's a good article here, Humanitarian Intervention or Colonial Tourism. What happens is a lot of people from the West, they come to Israel and they go up to Palestine, the Palestinian area, Judea, Samaria, also called the West Bank. And they say, oh, look at the oppression of the Palestinians, and this is just terrible, this is just awful. This article is very good, and it points out some historical facts that just don't match up with what these leftists think. Their reasoning is flawed. Just like, remember the opening statements I started with? I was just thinking. Their reasoning is flawed. They've lost the ability to reason. But here's just some things from this article. The arguments are made against the American recognition of Jerusalem are based on a 1949 UN resolution designating Jerusalem and Bethlehem as a corpus separatum to be placed under an international regime. That's the operative UN resolution. It says that Jerusalem and Bethlehem are to become internationalized, not the Palestinian capital that all these people think that it's going to be. Europe's hijacking of the Palestinian cause came to the fore in U.S. decision to move its embassy to Jerusalem. While Palestinians strongly objected to the move, the European reaction was emotional and aggressive. The passionate European stance on Jerusalem should be viewed by Palestinians with a healthy dose of skepticism. The arguments are made against the American recognition of Jerusalem are based on the 1949 UN resolution. Palestinians are aware that three European powers tried to conquer Jerusalem or Palestine in the last 2 centuries. Two of those, the French in 1799 and the British in 1917, also issued declarations that such conquests would be made in order to give Palestine to the Jews, its rightful heirs, as the French stated, Napoleon. It was also restated by Balfour in the Balfour Declaration. The one European intervention that was supposed to help the Palestinian Arabs came from the Germans in the 1940s. The Germans adopted the Palestinian Arabs for their own war against the British and therefore helped promote the most radical elements in Palestinian society. This in turn contributed to Palestinians rejecting compromise in 1947 and opting to go to war. But it's just not European intervention of the past that should worry Palestinians. Today, too, statements by European leaders about Jerusalem should raise eyebrows. For example, French President Emmanuel Macron said the status of Jerusalem is a question of international security that concerns the entire international community. Why should this city all of a sudden be a matter for the international community, or turned into a UN colony, as some experts suggest? European meddling goes much further. The EU has taken a number of measures in an effort to shut down Jewish-owned businesses in the West Bank. And so that's very very interesting article. And then just a few more things and we'll wrap it up. IDF strikes Syria. Early in the week, they shot down a Syrian jet that had strayed into Israeli territory. Could have been an accident. I think probably was an accident. Their Air Force is not that great, but they shot down, the pilot was killed up in the Golan. These are a number of headlines just from the other day. Look at these on the left. David Sling interceptor fired for first time in the north. Problem was they fired it, but it missed. The missile landed in Syria, and I'm just going to suggest that the Iranians, the Syrians, and the Russians are tearing apart the remains to find out how the system operates. I don't view that as good news. Now, look, Israel can reprogram everything very quickly, and they may already have. Israel also, Moscow offered to move the Iranians 100 kilometers from the Golan, Israel, the border there with Israel and the Golan. Israel's rejected that. I hear they're reconsidering it. We don't know exactly how that's going to be. We just don't know exactly what's going to happen there. And then down here in the lower left-hand corner, large Western Wall stone falls on egalitarian section. So when you go to the Western Wall, the Kotel, it's the retaining wall of the Temple Mount. And by the way, I agree that the Temple Mount is where the temple was. I know there's other arguments, but I just don't think they really hold water upon deep analysis. Mainly because it involves water, to be honest with you. But so in the Western Wall, there have long been two sections. Offensive mill, there's a section for the men. You can go down along to the tunnels. That's both men and women can go into the tunnels. But for prayer, they separate the men from the women. So on the left, you'll see the men praying, and on the right, you'll see the women praying. And there's been a big push that towards the southern end of the Temple Mount, of this Western Wall, they have been trying to get an egalitarian section where men and women can both go together. What happened this week was there was a lady, she was standing all the way in the corner of the section, as far south as you could get, and about 78, 79 years old, and she was praying, Jewish, and this big section of the wall fell, about 450-pound chunk of rock came crashing down onto the wood deck there that they have. And she said, I didn't see it. I didn't hear it. I didn't see it or hear it coming. Now, that's had a couple reactions. Some people have said, well, see, that's what you get for trying to establish an egalitarian section there, because God's sending you a message that you shouldn't have men and women praying at the wall together. The Arabs, on the other hand, the Palestinians, Mahmoud Abbas and others, have said, look, the Jews are trying to tear down the Temple Mount. They're trying to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. If you remember, there was a few years ago, the southern wall started to bulge a bit because of, I personally think because of construction done by the Muslim Arabs on the Temple Mount. In the area of what's known as Solomon's Stables, I don't think it was really Solomon's Stables, but that's what it's called, the Waqf, the Muslim authority that controls the Temple Mount, installed it. There's a giant mosque there, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Then there's also the Dome of the Rock to the north. That's the Golden Dome that you see. By the way, that Golden Dome wasn't a Golden Dome until King Hussein of Jordan put gold on it back in the 60s and 70s. So you see old pictures, it's just sort of a black dome, but they put gold on it to make it more attractive. But that's not really a mosque. It's kind of a commemorative building. And a lot of people think that it's built on the site of where the temple was. There was a church there at one time. It's octagon shape. But so to the east, towards the Mount of Olives on the Temple Mount, the Arabs built an underground mosque. I've seen pictures of this. You can't really go in it when you go there. It will accommodate somewhere between, it's big, 30 and 50,000 worshipers at once. It's one of the largest mosques in the world. Well, when they were building that, it put pressure on the southern wall of the Temple Mount, and it started to bulge out. And then, of course, then the Muslim Waqf and others said, well, look, they're trying to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So, and this is a very important mosque for Muslims. Even Khomeini in Iran refers to it as our first mosque. Now, there's no historical basis for that. And by the way, it does not point towards Mecca. You know, the mosques are supposed to point towards Mecca. Actually, most of the early mosques, you can go up to the city in Lebanon, near the Bekaa Valley. I can't remember the name of it. A big mosque up there, one of the early mosques. It points the same direction as the mosque on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then there are a number of others. They all point to, not Mecca, but they point to, guess where? Petra. You can look up, Jay Smith did a talk at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills a number of years ago where he talked about this. It's an excellent talk. You ought to look it up on YouTube. So this is what's going to happen anytime Israel tries to do anything. Now look, I know from prophecy there's going to be a temple up there. I do not know the mechanism exactly how that's going to happen. Some people, by the way, they'll put the temple down above the old city of David, near the Guyon Spring. That's an Arab neighborhood. It's not going to be any easier to build it there than it is on the Temple Mount. It's going to be a huge problem. Something has to happen. Something has to happen to allow that to take place. Exactly what that is, I mean, there's a lot of speculation. Is it a Psalm 83 war? Is it Ezekiel 38 and 39? All I can say is I just know it's going to be there. Scripture does not give us a roadmap as to how that happens. So let me close with this. This is a leftist protester who's putting this for a protest, and this is the world, and the title of the article in Foreign Policy just came out the other day. The world order is starting to crack. And who's responsible for that? Well, what world leader has orange hair? And people are losing their minds. We need to talk more about that, but we'll have to do it next week. So, a lot of exciting things going on. Pay attention. I would really pay attention to the news. Be in the Word, though, and be reading not just the New Testament, read the Old Testament. Homework for this week, I would go home and I would read 2 Thessalonians through. Then I would read chapter 1 and chapter 2 again. And then I would suggest you go read Isaiah chapter 66 and see the connection, because all of the New Testament writers, especially in prophetic passages, almost always base what they were writing about on the Old Testament. John, Revelation, I think 85% of John or Revelation has allusions to the Old Testament. So you got to be reading the Old Testament. It's not just the New Testament. It's not just the epistles that you should be paying attention to. The whole thing is interconnected, and you should look at that. So do that, and we'll talk next week. Father, thanks so much for your word. Pray that you'll bless us this week. Lord, we thank you for the provision that you've made here for Fellowship Bible Chapel in providing a building. We thank you so much for meeting our needs. And we know that that you prepared that place for us. And we pray that we will be worthy of using it to your glory and for the spreading of the gospel. In Jesus' name, amen.